So what I wanted to do today, I wasn't really sure what the audience was going to be. I mean, I guess I'm assuming that I'm focusing on senior undergraduates that have a pretty good grasp of biology, right, and ecology, and in environmental sciences. So I wanted to give you a fair amount of information here on what we've been doing in my lab, relevant to the conservation of fishes in the Great Plains, right? And so there's a lot of problems in the Great Plains, and so hopefully I'll end on an up note. It won't be too depressing for you. And so just a brief overview, the Great Plains expand from Texas all the way up into Canada, and from Colorado out into the Midwest of the Great Lakes area, right? And so it's a fairly large range. Kansas is right in the middle of it. And a lot of the rivers and the areas we work in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, are really pretty good examples of some of the issues that are problematic throughout the Great Plains. So how many of you like to fish? How many? Okay, good, good. I'm not going to ask if anybody hates fish or thinks they stink, because I don't want to hear that, because I love fish, and we're just going to go with that assumption. But there's an amazing diversity of fish in these Great Plains area. There's over 120 species of fish, and they're all different types of fish. If you look at the prairie, a lot of you think of the charismatic species like a bison that grazes in that prairie. These two fish that I've shown you on the upper left, the central stone roller, and the lower right is the southern red bellied ace. These are actually fish that graze. They're grazers just like a bison, but they live in the streams. So they're really abundant, but they actually scrape all that algae off the rocks. And as you can imagine, they're important species in the ecosystems, in these stream ecosystems, just like a bison's an important species in the tall grass prairie. There's a lot of really interesting species, some old relic dinosaur species that were here similar forms were around well before the dinosaurs were. Like the shovel-nosed sturgeon there up on the left, and the long-nosed gar, and these occur in these prairie streams. So these are really old fish. They look like these old dinosaurs. And then there's just a whole slew of other species, a lot of species of interest to people who sport fish, like the flathead catfish in the lower left. Some of the sunfish are just amazingly colorful, beautiful animals that occur in these rivers, like in the upper right there. That's the long-eared sunfish. And then, there's also these large fish that migrate, just like a salmon might, but the suckers. So in this case, these are the red horses. That's a type of sucker, and they go on these long migrations, and they move up and down to escape some of the harsh conditions in these prairie rivers. So I hope you can appreciate. I mean, it's hard for people. These are often muddy rivers. You can't see these fish, but when you get out there, if you're a fish biologist and you start scooping them out of there, you really appreciate the diversity that's out there. And so, as I've always been interested in diversity, the people that work in my lab are interested in this. And so we're also interested in, the problems or the declines in this diversity. So what I'll do today is I'll talk to you about some of those problems and the demise of these fishes. And I say the demise because we're really at a crisis here where there's a lot of bad things happening to these water systems. Just because, we're humans, we need water, but fish also need water. And that's a major conflict. And then, so in particular, we'll talk about fragmentation and drought, because these are two problems that are particularly causing the decline of this diversity. And then I'll end with this idea of rivers of the Anthropocene. So we're moving into a new era where we have these unique challenges. And what are our options for conservation? So so we started plowing up the prairie well before the 1900s, right? Into the 1800s, we started converting that natural prairie into agricultural areas. And with this, a lot of sediment moved into the streams. And so you can see that over 90% of the total land area in the Great Plains was converted to agriculture by the the 1940s, the mid-1900s, right? And so what this graph also shows on the right there is the surface area of reservoirs. That's the second sort of dash with the dot line. And so we also started figuring out how to capture water and use it to prevent flooding or to to maintain navigation in large rivers and for water use. And we started building reservoirs. And so by the 80s, we've pretty much dammed up all the areas that were feasible areas to put a dam. And then we also, the technology after the Second World War, we developed the technology to pump water out of the ground. And so the irrigated farmland began in the late 50s, and it's still increasing a little bit, or peaked out here by the 80s. And so you can see, here we are in 2015, and it's been 35 years that these animals have been living under this new regime where you had a converted landscape, you've got all these reservoirs, and you've had this irrigated or pumping the aquifer. And this has taken its toll on the fishes. Just as an example, in Kansas, so western Kansas used to be a lot different than it is today. A lot of the streams were flowing year-round. There's a lot of spring habitats. And so this is a federally endangered species, the Topeka shiner. And those circles, there's kind of sparse data. There wasn't a lot of people out collecting prior to the 1950s, but this fish occurred all the way out into the western Kansas, out in the western, Smoky Hill drainage. If you look at the distribution now, though, all those pink dots are where it currently occurs. There's a lot more sampling, but they still occur in the Flint Hills area, but all those populations in western Kansas have been extirpated. And all that red sort of fuzz in the background, you probably can't see it very well. Those are all the reservoirs and ponds that have been built on the landscape. And so, another species, just to go over a couple of these, here's the Arkansas River shiner. And so this is named after the Arkansas River, or the Arkansas River. And this species used to be abundant, and that's what those circles, those black open circles or black dots represent. Those are historic collections of this fish. But this fish now no longer occurs in Kansas because it's been extirpated because of all these issues. And this is Dr. Frank Cross was an ichthyologist. He worked at the University of Kansas Natural History Museum. But he was one of the people that actually was able to document where these fish occurred before all these changes happened. And in his field notes, he sampled that spot where the star is there, and he says Natropus gerardi, which is this fish, was abundant and dominant. So this was actually the dominant fish. So it's a small fish, but this was the dominant fish that occurred in that system at the time. And so everything, but that's changed because now it's gone. And so some other species have changed, and this graph just basically shows 6 different species in the Arkansas River and their decline over time. And on the y-axis there, it basically shows the proportion of sites and where you would expect to find this. So like for example, the Arkansas shiner on the lower left, you tend to, it was never that abundant. You could go out and catch it at about 20 or 30% of the sites you'd sample, but now you don't get it at all. But you can see some other species. I'm going to talk a lot about the plains minnow and a similar species to the shoal chub. All these species have declined, and some of them have disappeared. So the things that are causing this are fragmentation is probably the top of the list, and I'm going to talk about intrinsic factors, and so these are the traits of the species, which species tend to go extinct or are extirpated, and then extrinsic factors, so the characteristics of the dams or the fragments that drive these population dynamics. And so this is a diagram. I hope you guys can read that. This basically shows you why fragmentation is problematic. And so at the top there we have fragmentation, which is natural, but there's also, or anthropogenic, means that humans can cause that, but also, there's natural fragmentation. There's all natural waterfalls and whatnot. But that causes isolation, right? And so you're limiting the dispersal of these animals. And depending on the life history traits or the characteristics of the species, that isolation could be bad, like a migratory fish, like a salmon. That's obviously bad if you isolate them. It could depend on, like barrier permeability, so if you put a barrier in there, but some fish can, are good swimmers, they might be able to jump up over a waterfall, it may not be so bad. And so, but ultimately what happens is you get smaller populations. And when you have smaller populations, they're more prone, if you get a drought, and I'll talk about that, or a disturbance, that they're more prone to go extinct once you get those small populations. And so once you have these things, they combine to influence the demography or the population dynamics and the genetic diversity. I won't talk too much about that, but you can get inbreeding when you have small populations. And eventually you get decline, these populations decline or go extinct. And so just as an example, we've been looking at some river fragments, or these chunks of river that these different types of species occur in throughout the Great Plains. And so we've got 3 species there, the plains minnow, and this is pelagic, and what it does, that's the reproductive strategy. So when it spawns its eggs into the water, and then those eggs drift, they get fertilized immediately, and then they drift through the water. They drift down the river for a while. And then their larvae drift for a while. So they actually drift a long way after they spawn. And then those young have to swim back up. And so as you can imagine, if you break the river into chunks, then that's problematic for a species that needs to drift a long way. The emerald shiner is a pelagic substrate spawner, so they'll spawn in the substrate, but then those larvae will drift. So again, this is problematic when you break the river into chunks. But then the red shiner is a crevice spawner, and so this fish, it'll spawn in between rocks or something, and then those juveniles will just grow up right there. So this fish, we would expect, wouldn't really be affected by breaking the river up into chunks, because it doesn't really need to drift or move large distances. And so what we've done is we've identified the major rivers in the Great Plains, or at least in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, a little bit of Wyoming, and the Dakotas, and we've identified the fragments between barriers. So where there's dams, we've identified those fragments. And and a striking pattern occurs is that these pelagic fish, if you look at the proportion of those species, there's probably about 8 of those species that have gone extinct or extirpated from those fragments. When you get a fragment length less than 100 river kilometers, when you get a really short fragment, almost 100% of those have been extirpated from that reach. So they cannot survive in a river reach that's only 100 kilometers, right? But if a river reach is over 300 kilometers, then there's 0 extirpation, so then they survive, they all do well, right? So this is about 8 species of pelagic fish. The plains minnow is just an example. There's a little cartoon that shows how they spawn. The males and females, they get to this little swim together in this dance, and these eggs just blow up, and then they float downstream. But as you can imagine, so breaking the river into chunks has been problematic, and these fish just cannot survive in these small chunks. And in fact, if we look at what's happened now is by fragmenting these rivers, we've actually changed the dominant species. And so I told you the Arkansas River shiner, and that's a pelagic species, used to be dominant, and now it's gone. What we see here is that when we go from these wetter, longer fragments to drier, shorter fragments, we see a change in the species that you find. And this graph basically just shows, on the top graph is an ordination, or it's a multivariate analysis. Basically looks at how these river fragments differ in the amount of discharge, or how much flow is in the river, and then how much time they dry. And so basically the fragments on the left are larger fragments that have a lot more discharge or flow, and fragments on the right are chunks that are small and that they dry off, so they can go dry during drought periods. And so if we think of these 2 species, there are different types of species where we have the plains minnow, which is the pelagic spawner, and the red shiner, which is a crevice spawner. What we see is when we move from these wet, large chunks of river to these smaller chunks that dry, we get a shift from these pelagic fish to these crevice spawning fish, right? And so we've seen this throughout the Great Plains, that we've seen this shift from all these large, these pelagic fish to these crevice spawning fish. So I took a gamble here, and I thought you guys here at middle of the day on a nice sunny day that you would want to learn a little bit about graph theory, right? I'm not sure if this is a good idea or not, but this is kind of a new way as a conservation biologist to look at these riverscapes, what we call them. So this is a river landscape, so it's a riverscape, and how we can use that information to prioritize, areas we want to conserve or barriers we want to remove. And so if you think about a landscape as a bunch of patches of habitat, and the connectivity among those patches can be really important. And this can be applied to river systems. And so again, if we look at the Great Plains, we have all these river systems. There's a lot of stuff going on here, but basically those numbers on this map represent a fragment of river that occurs between barriers, right? Like a dam or a dry reach or something, right? And so we can represent those fragments using graph theory as nodes or these circles, right? In this simpler diagram to the upper right. So I've highlighted the Arkansas River Basin here in the middle here. Is anybody offended when I call it the Arkansas? Because I know a lot of Kansas call it the Arkansas. So, okay. Well, either way, I don't care, but I just don't want to offend anybody. But the Ark River, how about we call it the Ark River? So the Ark River, you can see down in Oklahoma is the Cimarron River, and so you can see fragment like 15 is over there in the panhandle of Oklahoma, western Kansas, and you can see that circle on the graph in the upper right is 15. And then it's separated by you can see a little yellow barrier. Then that's fragment 14 is below it. And so the way to interpret this is that the size of those nodes or those circles in that upper right-hand graph represents how long of a fragment that section of river is, right? And then the lines connecting them represent the type of barrier. And so you can see on the key there's reservoirs, small dams, or hydraulic like dry reaches. But what we've done is then color-coded those nodes or those circles based on the occurrence of these pelagic spawning fish. And so white means that they're abundant there, you find them, and black means they're absent, and gray is their low abundance. And so what this graph shows you, basically, it's just what I just told you and showed you with the other data, is that the large fragments, 14, 16, and 17, although 17 is small, it's connected to 16. But those larger chunks tend to have higher abundances or presence of those pelagic fish, right? But the little chunks out there, like 15 or 20 or 21, so those are all in the Ark River upstream of Wichita. Those fish have declined or disappeared, right? All right, so I'm going to come back to this actually when we talk about conservation. I'm not sure why it did that. But anyway, you can do this graph theory. We can look at the Red River, the Canadian River, the Kansas River, the Platte River. We can look at all these, and you see the same pattern, that those large circles, which are the large fragments, have a higher probability that you're going to catch these pelagic fish. And these little bitty chunks are black. Those little circles are black, and that means that those fish have been extirpated or are in low abundance in those areas. So we'll come back to that. But so let's see. So occurrences greatest in large fragments. Large nodes with high probability of drying also had low probability of occurrence. And these graphs are helpful in barrier prioritization, which I'll come back to. Okay, so now let's talk about drought. And so when you have this fragmented river, you've isolated all these areas. What happens when you get a drought? And we just came out of a big drought, or I'm not sure if we've really come out of it, but in 2011 and 12 we had pretty massive droughts here. Here's just if you look at these drought severity maps of the Great Plains, you can see where we're working at the Ark River. I've circled with the green circles, and you can see in 2011, we were in these extreme droughts, or at least exceptional drought periods in this area. And so we can see that, you can see from the picture there that you go from a fairly wide river, sandy river, to little fragments of river, or actually dry rivers in many of these cases. And these graphs show the hydrograph. So this is just the amount of flow in those rivers, the discharge in those rivers. The gray is sort of the seasonal or the annual average across the record of at which those gauging stations have collected flow data. And then the blue and red are what happened in 2011, 2012. And so you can see 11 and 12 were way below those normal flow levels. And so, and in a few of our sites, they just dried up completely, so nothing was there. And so let's focus in on three of these pelagic fish, these pelagic spawning fish: the Arkansas shiner, which I've talked about, the plains minnow, and then the pepper chub. These are all, they have this life history that they'll spawn these pelagic eggs, and then they need to drift downstream for a while. And what we see is, if we look at each one of these over time, and this is just in the Ark River, or the watershed, is that we see that the Ark shiner, you can see it used to occur until about the 80s. So those dots, what I'm presenting there is just the dots represent a collection where they were either present or absent. And so in the 80s, before the 80s, you still would collect these in some of your collections. So if you went out and sampled, you'd get some. But by the 80s, they disappeared, and so you can see that line that they've declined. The plains minnow kind of hung on until the mid-80s, maybe the early 90s. And you can see it, but I'm going to show you, zoom into these more recent years. But the plains minnow is also, the probability of going out there and getting it has declined. And then this pepper chub is the last one to disappear, and it was present up to 2011, but we haven't caught it since then. So this is a fish that literally has gone extinct, probably when maybe some of you, before some of you started college, or after some of you started college, right? Or shall I say, extirpated from this system anyway. There's a population in Texas remaining. But what's the role of drought? And so what we see is, if we look at this a little closer detail at these two species, so we know the Arkansas River shiner has disappeared, but the plains minnow, which are the diamonds, and then the shoal chub, or the pepper chub, or the circles, we see that in 2001 we had a 3 years of drought in the Ark Basin there. And the first year drought, what happens is you tend to get higher abundances of them, because basically the water is constricted to a smaller area, and they all get kind of crammed in that small area. So you catch a fair number of individuals that were probably spawned the last year. But then the next year, then the final year, you get declining numbers. And so we see that both species were able to withstand that drought in 2001 to 2003, but they declined. In 2006 to 2008, what we saw is both species basically disappeared, but the plains minnow didn't recover. So you can see that in 2011, 12, and 13, we didn't catch that fish. The pepper chub, it did come back. We got a few individuals, but it disappeared in 2012 and 13, and we were out there last year and didn't catch it either. And so what's happening is we're seeing that these fish are disappearing during these droughts. And as you can imagine, when you break these systems into chunks where you isolate them, there's no way for them to recover once they disappear. They can't recover from someplace else. And so this is where the title of this talk or seminar was Ratcheting Down the Diversity of Fish. And we kind of we use the analogy of a ratchet, because you turn a ratchet in one direction, you can't go back, right? And so what happens is when you're a fragment of river and you get a drought rolls through and it kills everything in that chunk. Because of the dams and the barriers, that fish can't come back into there from another. It can't recolonize that from another area. So you've turned that ratchet. And so this just illustrates that you've got your fish that are distributed among the barriers. Pay attention to the little white probably the 1, 2, 3, fourth from the left, the little white fish. You go into drought, they kind of get lower in abundance, but then in panel C there, you've got really low flow, and that white fish is gone. And then when you pop out of the drought, there's no way for that fish to recover. And so you've ratcheted down this diversity. And that's what we're seeing with the Arkansas shiner, the plains minnow, and the pepper chub in the Ark River. They've all basically disappeared, and there's no way to recover them naturally. Okay, so now that we're at a low point of depression, thinking about these poor fish disappearing, what can we do about it? And so Leroy Poff, who's a professor up at the Colorado State University, sort of had a nice quick little article on the rivers of the Anthropocene, suggesting that, we've changed these systems to a point where we can't really recover them back to their natural state. So it's impossible to go back and restore the natural system, right? And so this is a picture of the Arkansas River, or the Ark River in Wichita at Lincoln Street. So at Lincoln Street they have this dam, because has anybody gone to Riverfest in Wichita? Couple of you? Okay, good. So, well, Riverfest is really popular, and they like to have this little lake there, and they have it by the Children's Museum and all that, and they have a dam for that. But that dam is a barrier to fish movement. And so there was some mitigation money because of some chemical spill or whatever, and so they used that money to build this fishway. And so now what they're trying to do is see if the fish, especially these pelagic spawning fish, can open the connectivity of this system by allowing them access through this barrier that used to stop their movement. And so, as a conservation biologist, there's actually a lot of literature out there and options for removing barriers. And what this graph just shows you is how much it costs, and then the net habitat gain. And so what the point here is that the first couple $1 million you spend, you can recover a lot of habitat if you prioritize which barriers you remove. So for example, that Lincoln Street barrier, cost a couple $1 million or $1 million or two to make or to build. But if you put those in strategic locations, you can recover a lot of habitat. So you can make those nodes, remember those circles, you can connect two small circles and make a big circle, or connect a small circle to a big circle, and really optimize the benefit of that action. And so going back to this this node diagram, this graph theory, is if we look at like the Red River in western Oklahoma, you see that you have these large fragments of river, and for a conservation biologist, you'd want to make these conservation priorities, right? And so these are the ones you want to maintain. You don't want to put a dam on those because they're maintaining diversity. But then those little ones, they're little fragments that are drying, those you can deprioritize. So you shouldn't really worry too much about what's going on there. If we go back to the Ark system, again, we could see that, we have some priority habitats like the Cimarron River, the lower Cimarron River, and the lower Ark River. But if you think about also where we want to put it, where we would take out a dam, right, or put a fishway, there's a couple viable options. So interestingly, if you look at fragments 18 to 20, right, so you can hardly see it, but 20, all they've done there is they've reconnected a very small fragment, 20 to 21, because once you get upstream of Lincoln Street in Wichita, then you go to the 21st Street and there's another dam, right? So they're really, that fish barrier has only freed up maybe, several kilometers of river, right? And so that's probably not the optimal place to put a fishway. But on the other hand, if you were to remove that barrier between fragment 20 and 21, then you would open up a whole lot of area above Wichita on the Ark River, right? And so that's the next priority, I think, for that area, is to remove that dam. So the other thing you could do is, let's say you can't remove a dam. So we're not going to take out Tuttle Creek, right, or Milford Dam. Those are really too hard to take out. So the other option is that you can move these fish. Actually, humans can move them and put them back where they've been extirpated. So if a drought comes through and wipes out the population, there's actually a lot of non-native or native fish hatcheries that are being created. So Colorado has one. Kansas is working one down in Farlington. They're working on putting one in. And you can raise these in a hatchery, and then you can reintroduce them into these fragments where they've disappeared. One of the things you need to know, your genetics. So those of you who've had to take genetics and maybe didn't like it so much, you got to know your genetics, because you can't just go throwing things around willy-nilly, because those genetics are important for their ability to survive. In this case, we've done some genetic work on these fish, and it looks like as you move north, the genetic diversity of these fish declines. And it has to do with their their history of recovery after the glaciers, the glaciation, is that those northern populations have been recovered later than the southern populations. And so if your goal is to maintain genetic diversity, you might want to recolonize areas with those southern fish. But there's also unique population structure, genetic structure. So for the plains minnow in the top graph, this is just a heat map. The red areas, they show the location of the genetic structure of different populations. And so the Red River, the Ark, and Canadian River, and then the Kansas Platte River are three separate populations, are unique genetically. And so ideally you wouldn't want to disrupt that local adaptation or that local structure, so you would introduce from those areas. And then finally, something I didn't really talk much about, but groundwater, this irrigated land and pumping the aquifer, that shrinks these habitats further, and it causes fragmentation. And so what this graph basically shows is, on the left axis is the linear miles, are those let's see, I'm sorry, on the right is the linear kilometers of stream, and on the right is the amount of irrigated lands, and so, or diverted water. And so what you see is, since this, advent of groundwater irrigation in the late 50s, we've seen an increase in the amount of groundwater that's been used, but we've seen a decrease in the amount of stream habitat, so the linear length of stream. So the length of stream has declined, and it seems to have stabilized since the 80s, although I think with some of the climate change issues where we have warming streams, we're seeing the disappearance of a lot of these speeding up in the recent years. And this is just an example. In the upper center is the Arickaree River, so that's way in the northwest corner of the state. The Arickaree River used to be a wide sand-bottom stream. A lot of these pelagic fish used to exist there. On the lower left is a picture taken in 1996. So it was, because of irrigation or groundwater withdrawals, it has declined to a small stream. And then recently in 2006, you can go out there in the lower right, and there's no stream there anymore. It's basically just a grass swamp, if anything. And so this is pretty indicative of the whole western Kansas because of the decline in the Great Plains aquifer. And some of the things we've been doing recently is modeling, what happens if we keep pumping that groundwater at the rate that we're pumping it. And we can actually look at the change in these groundwater well levels, and we can predict in the future how much stream is going to be left. And so what we see is if we move up into 2060, we'll see that an additional 250 kilometers of stream could be lost in the next 45 years if we just keep pumping like the groundwater like we're pumping it now. And so just to summarize all this, this fragmentation has eroded the diversity of these Great Plains rivers. These species traits, so these pelagic spawning fish have been the ones that have been hit the hardest. We get these punctuated declines during drought. So we're seeing these declines, but they really are apparent during drought. And then, but as a conservation biologist, there's a lot of options we can do to mitigate some of these problems, right? So there's a lot of good things that we could be doing out there, and hopefully you guys, with this, environmental resource or environmental science background, when you get into the workforce, you can be thinking about these options and not just throwing up your arms and saying, hey, there's nothing we can do about it, right? And so, I just want to make sure you understand this is a work of my lab, a lot of graduate students and postdocs as well as collaborators. So a lot of times I said, what we've been doing, but these guys were doing a lot of the work, in particular Josh Perkin there, who was a postdoc in my lab. Actually, he's not at K-State, he's at Tennessee Tech now. I need to change that. Anyway, that's all I got. If there's any questions, happy to. Yeah.
I guess, what is the ecological importance of fish,
Yeah. So the ecological importance of those things? Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and that's actually, that's always a hard question to ask, right? Somebody said, well, why should anybody care about these fish, right? They're all fairly small fish, but you got to realize there's probably a number of things. One. They're an indicator of the health of the system, right? And so, like in the Ark River there in Wichita, there's been some pretty devastating chemical spills and whatever. And the way they identify that is they see the fish that have died, right? And so there's kids swimming around and drinking water. And so that's, they're just sort of the canary in the coal mine. So keep maintaining that diversity means that you're maintaining a healthy system. They also were really dominant, so these were they were a major part of the food web in the whole ecosystem, right? And so a lot of people can probably relate to like catfish or sport fish, right? Well, those things need to eat something, and so when you change the communities, you're changing the food web, and you might change everything, other components. That's not to say that the red shiner, is just as good as a meal for a flathead catfish as a plains minnow, but that could be a problem. But there's also just the inherent, I think we just need to think, we can't just go through and watch species disappear from Earth because of what we're doing, right? I mean, the example I always like to use is that kids always love diversity, but adults don't really care sometimes, But anytime you take a kid out to a stream and you say, hey, this is that, and that's this species, and that's this species, they're always really excited about it, right? And the thing is, an adult will ask the question, well, what good is that fish, and why do we need to save that, right? And so I wish people were a little bit more like kids and could just appreciate that, hey, there's a lot of different cool things in that river, right? So it's a great question, and it's something that you guys also, if you're into conservation, that's something you should think about. Why? Because you're going to get asked that question a lot. So, yeah.
I was curious, is there a difference in the success rates for reintroduction of fish species when you take them from like a fish hatchery or if you take them from like a natural population?
Yeah, so there's two options. One is you could raise them in a fish hatchery and then introduce them. The other option is to just move them, right? Just go grab them from one area and move them around. That's a great question. I don't really know the answer to. I know there's some examples of catastrophic failures from hatchery fish where they get kind of acclimated to being fed like flakes or something every day, and they have to go out into the wild and learn how to collect food on their own. So that in that case, moving them around would be the better option. The problem is, sometimes when you bring them in the hatchery, there's a pretty strict protocol to make sure they're disease-free, and you're not transporting something else that you don't know from one area to the next, right? And so that's probably why the hatchery option is probably favored a little bit more. There was an example for the plains minnow. They caught some from the Salt Fork of the Ark River. They brought it back to Colorado to reproduce, but it had a virus, a fish virus, and so they basically had to, they couldn't use those fish to restock them because of that virus. But I would suspect the success would be better if you just transported them, but there's issues with that, right? great question. Yeah.
I could ask a lot of questions, so I'll try to limit that. It was really interesting when you were describing the different types of barriers and fragmentation issues with barriers, and I especially kind of latched onto the hydrologic and the hydraulic barrier stretches that just simply go dry. How consistent are those dry spots in the river from over time? Is that, do the same hydraulic barriers appear drought year after drought year? Do they move around the stream? How hard is it to get a handle on where those locations?
Well, so yeah, that's great. I'm glad you asked. I kind of glazed over the barrier permeability issue because some barriers, like like Bowersock, I don't know if you're familiar. You go down to Lawrence. There's a dam in Lawrence. That's a pretty significant barrier, but at high flows, fish can move over it, right? So that's not a permanent barrier. And like some of these dry reaches, they during a really wet year, they can be connected. So they're not disconnected completely. But like Milford Reservoir, Milford Dam or Tuttle Creek Dam, that barrier, the fish aren't getting around that thing. There's no way. It doesn't matter what flow. So the hydraulic barriers, though, for the most part, those are the upstream extent, and we use that as the upstream barrier. And so sometimes they are, in a wet year, they might move up more, but they're sort of the upstream extent. But the other example is like the Ark River around Dodge City. I mean, I don't think that thing has flowed in decades, right? And so there's a hydraulic barrier that just never is connected. I'm trying to think. I'm not sure if there's too many examples of where, because the Ark River in Colorado is still, it's a pretty substantial river, right? But then it dries out when it hits Kansas, and then it comes back again near Great Bend, right? So that hydraulic barrier is pretty stable, and it's going to take a heck of a storm to get that thing moving. I'm not really sure if we had. There's probably a couple others that I can't think of that probably connect at some point. But you're right; they're not complete 100% barriers.
Do you see the barriers over time, these really significant hydraulic barriers, moving east over time with groundwater withdrawal, with climate issues?
Yeah, they certainly have, and the Ark River is the perfect example where it's sort of migrated east, and basically pinched off the or just made that eastern portion shorter and shorter, right? And I think it's still moving, probably. Yeah. All right, well, let's thank Dr. Gido one more time. All right. Yeah. Thanks.